Another key issue when it comes to Hebrews is, where is resurrection? I don't know if you noticed as you read through, but there are not a lot of references to Jesus' resurrection. Scholars usually say that that's because it presents Christ primarily by focusing on his crucifixion or his sacrifice and his exaltation, his work as high priest. So it focuses on those two aspects. You do have a possible reference in 1320. Now may the God of peace, who brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant. Well, what does it mean that he brought him back from the dead? Well, that could easily refer to resurrection, though some have interpreted it differently. You also get in 5:7, he prays to the one who was able to save him from death, and his prayers were heard. Well, if he's praying to the one who can save him from death and his prayers were heard, what does that mean? It seems to suggest, because we know he died. So again, that could also be implying that he was resurrected. There are four options. It could be that he simply passes over a resurrection, he assumes it, it's not his focus, so he doesn't mention it. That's F.F. Bruce and kind of the standard evangelical line. Some have suggested that resurrection is more of a spiritual ascension here. So it's a spiritual thing, and it gets merged with exaltation. According to Harold Attridge, who wrote the Hermeneia volume on Hebrews, the author doesn't believe in resurrection, and that's why he doesn't mention it, because he doesn't think Christ was actually resurrected. I don't find that so compelling. And then David Moffat, who is a friend of mine from Duke, argues that resurrection is a crucial component in Hebrews, that the argument basically doesn't work if Jesus wasn't resurrected. And I think he's right, so we're going to go through his argument. He starts out by looking at this contrast in 1:7-8. And of the angels, he says, who makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness, therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. What is the contrast that's being made here? There's a but in verse 8. So what is the contrast? We're contrasting angels and the Son, and what is the basis of the difference? What is it that differentiates them? When he talks about angels, he talks about what? What they're made of, right? Mm-hmm. Angels, they're spirits and fire. So what would you expect the contrast to be? Angels are spirits and fire. The Son is what? Flesh and blood. But we don't get that. Instead, we get this statement about your throne. Well, that's kind of curious. They're spirit and fire, and you have a throne. Yeah. So there seems, on the one hand, there's a close association of the Son with God, because as your throne, O God, is forever and ever. But then he also kind of differentiates the Son from God, because he says, therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. We get similar type things if you look at 1:3-4. He is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. When he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become as much better than the angels, as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. And then if you jump over to 13-14, but to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies a footstool for thy feet? Are they not all ministering spirits, sent to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? So there seems to be some contrast between being angels and getting to sit on the throne. What is it that qualifies the Son to sit on the throne?
His divinity.
That's what we often think, but what's the contrast here? Spirits and fire versus
flesh and blood.
Flesh and blood. It's his humanity that qualifies him to sit on the throne.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
It's his humanity. It's not his divinity. It's his humanity.
He became human.
Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same. Jesus came and became human because God had decreed that the world to come shall be governed by humans. So he took on human nature so that he could share in and enable our destiny. It's his humanity that enables him to sit on the throne, not his divinity. What is it about humanity that qualifies it? Well, what do we bear? We bear God's image. He goes on in 2:5-8. He did not subject to angels the world to come, concerning which we are speaking. But one has testified somewhere, saying, what is man that you remember him, or the son of man that you are concerned about him? You have made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, and have appointed him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to him. The world to come has been subjected to humanity. In this world, humanity is under the angels. They have authority over us. In the world to come, it gets switched. And humanity has authority over that. That's why Paul says you're going to judge angels. Can you not decide, this little matter among yourselves? Now, the world to come, first century Jews conceived of it as a renewed, incorruptible realm. It's the fulfillment of God's promise to give the land to Abraham, right? So Romans 4:13, God promised to give Abraham the world. Entrance into this world represents the point at which humanity's status in relation to the angels changes, right? In the world to come, humanity has the upper hand. And it's presented as the promised land or the inheritance of salvation, entering into this world to come. Now, he introduces this with this quotation from the Psalm. What is man that you remember him, or the son of man that you are concerned about him? And son of man can be both humanity, or it could refer to Jesus in particular. And he's probably playing on both of those possibilities at the end when he says, all things have been subjected to him, meaning Jesus, but we do not yet see all things subjected to him, meaning humanity as a whole. So everything's been subjected to Jesus, but not yet to all of humanity, because we're still in this world. So this is a reversal of the current order. Now, there are two other people that this Psalm 8 gets applied to. One is Adam. The other is Moses when he went into heaven to receive the Torah. So if you read Life of Adam and Eve, and this appears in the Cave of Treasures as well, it presents the fall as Satan's revenge for his ejection from heaven. And why is he rejected from heaven? Because he refused to worship Adam. And you'll note in Adam and Eve, the Life of Adam and Eve, it talks about, fire and spirit versus flesh. And that's why, God says, worship him. And Satan says, I'm fire and spirit. Why am I going to worship dirt? And he refuses to do it. As a result of the fall, Adam loses God's glory and dominion. He gives it over to Satan. But there is a hope that it will one day be restored. Okay, and so Jesus is being presented as the new Adam who restores what was lost. Note 1:6, when he again brings the firstborn into the world and says, let all the angels of God worship him. Right? Well, who was the firstborn that he brought into the world? Well, that would be Adam. Now he is again bringing the firstborn into the world. This time it's Jesus, and commanding all the angels to worship him. And why are angels to worship humanity? Because we bear the image of God. Right? In many ways, there is no greater calling than simply being human. Because as humans, we all bear the image of God. Again, 1:3, he's the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. Right? You don't get a more perfect representation of God's image than Jesus. And then 2:11, for both the one sanctifying and the ones being sanctified are all from one. Now, if you look at the NASB, it says one Father in italics, and it's capitalized, which suggests they think he's talking about God here. I don't think he's talking about God. I think he's talking about Adam. In other words, Jesus joined the sons of Adam, sons and daughters of Adam. He joined humanity. We're all human. The one sanctifying and the ones being sanctified are all human. We're all Adam's children. Again, Hebrews 1:6, when he brings the firstborn into the world to come, he says, let all God's angels worship him. Again, that's making a parallel between Adam and Jesus. And this brings up implications for resurrection. If it's Christ's humanity, his blood and flesh, that differentiate him from the ministering spirits and qualify him to sit on the throne, then he would presumably need to have this bodily presence when entering into his inheritance. In other words, flesh and blood can't just be something he came and took on here, and then after he's dead, his spirit or soul kind of rises to heaven, because then he's no different than the ministering spirits. If his humanity is what qualifies him to sit on the throne, then he needs to have the blood and flesh that make him human in heaven when he sits on the throne. Does that make sense?
I have a question.
Yes.
What about that scripture that says that flesh and blood cannot enter into heaven?
Exactly. And that raises a question. Well, how can a human dwell in heaven? Because heaven is the realm of holy and fiery spirits, and if we take our mortal flesh and blood up there, what happens? It just gets consumed. And this was a question that Jews actively wrestled with. Okay, that's why Paul, when he says, I know someone who was caught up into the third heaven, whether it was in body or not, I don't know. I don't want to get into that, because he recognizes there's an issue there. How can humans go into heaven? And so they had different ways. You know, you could dream about heaven. God could take your soul and take it up to heaven while your body stays here. So there were different ways of doing that. But one of the people who gets taken into heaven, and you have to address this, is Moses, when he goes up to receive the Torah. And this was the Shabbat reading, and we'll close with this. When Moses ascended on high, the ministering angel spake before the Holy One, blessed be he, sovereign of the universe. What business is one born of woman amongst us? In other words, why have you brought a human up here? He doesn't belong. He's come to receive the Torah, answered he to them. Said they to him, that secret treasure thou desirest to give to flesh and blood? There again, you see the contrast. What is man that thou art mindful of him? So God turns to Moses and says, return them an answer. Sovereign of the universe, replied he, I fear lest they consume me with the fiery breath of their mouths. Hold on to the throne of glory, he said to him. As it is said, he maketh him to hold on to the face of his throne, and spreadeth his cloud over him. Whereon Rabbi Nachman observed, this teaches that the Almighty spread the luster of his Shekinah and cast it as a protection over him. So how does God enable Moses to survive in the heavenly realm?
Lord,
He clothes him with his glory. Yes, and so the glory comes to rest. And once the glory rests on him, then what happens? The angel's attitude towards him changes like that, and suddenly even death, the angel of death himself, comes up and starts whispering his secrets to Moses. Because he's now clothed with God's glory. It is glory that protects us in the heavenly realm. What is it that Adam and Eve lost when they ate of the fruit? They lost his glory. They could no longer enter into the heavenly realms to commune with God. That's why they had to leave the garden. Jesus cannot enter the heavenly realms to sit at the throne until he has his resurrected, glorified body. We also have Moses and Joshua motifs. There's a big comparison with Moses in Hebrews 3. It says, Hebrews 2, 9-10, we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, not Moses. For it was fitting for him for whom are all things and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author. And the word there is archegos. That's the same word that is used of the spies who went into Canaan, who were the leaders of the people. And so he's portraying Jesus as the one who goes in to spy out the land, the promised land, which is the world to come. Jesus has to go to the cross with his mortal flesh, because mortal flesh can't enter into the heavenly realms. As a result, he's put to death, but he is resurrected, and his resurrected body is glorified, and that, it's indestructible flesh, unfading glory, and that is what enables him to enter into the heavenly realms. Now, where does Jesus make his sacrifice?
In the Holies.
In the Holy of Holies, which means it's not on the cross. It's not on the cross, because he's not a priest on earth. Cross is necessary, but that's not the point of atonement. That is what leads to resurrection, which enables him to then enter to the heavenly temple, which enables him to make the sacrifice there. And what is the sacrifice?
It's blood.
It's himself. And what does God say? Sit at my right hand. Well, what is God's throne? What do we call the place where God sits in the temple? Because remember, the earthly temple is
a heavenly sanctuary.
Well, you have the sanctuary, and the innermost part is the Holy of Holies. The mercy seat. The mercy. Where is Jesus? He's now sitting on the mercy seat with his blood flowing through him. So his blood is on the mercy seat.
Forever.
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 Right? Does that make sense? He gets his resurrected body. And this is why in John, when Mary sees him, he says, no, don't touch me yet, because I haven't ascended to my Father yet. Why is that? Because he can't be contaminated. The idea seems to be that he then takes his body with the blood flowing in it, the glorified body.
That's what,
he's able to go into heaven. And he presents himself to God, and God says, you know, when he makes the sacrifice, here I am, and God tells him, sit at my right hand. And so he takes a seat on the mercy seat, where his blood is forever on the mercy seat as he's able to intercede with God on our behalf. The key takeaway is resurrection has to be part of this argument. It has to be assumed, because otherwise he would not be able to go into heaven to make the sacrifice.